that he will resume presiding over the Council. Unfortunately, he could not be here at 3 o'clock, but he will come back, and he sent his regrets and his best wishes to his fellow ministers. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ayman Safadi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan.
On behalf of the whole Arab group, so I'm going to kindly ask you for the time necessary to speak on behalf of 22 countries. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Mr. President, esteemed colleagues, may the mercy, blessings, and peace of God be upon you. Our common humanity is today put to the test. Our moral values are being put to the test. The principles for which the United Nations was built and upon which the United Nations was built are being put to the test. We're facing a spiral of violence, a war based on despair over decades of occupation, injustice, and oppression. Innocent people are being killed. Children are being dismembered. The elderly, women are being killed. Homes are being bombarded. Hospitals with no drugs. A raging war that is razing Gaza to the ground. For this moment, the Security Council was established to apply international law, to maintain peace, to stop the war and violence, to prevent violence, to say that there is no difference between the people, that there is no state above the law, regardless of its might, regardless of its barbarism. But it seems that Israel is above the law. It is violating international law without any deterrent. It is running roughshod over Security Council resolutions. It's building settlements without any consequences. It is confiscating Palestinian land without accountability. It is expelling Jerusalemites from their homes without accountability. And the Security Council didn't even call for a ceasefire in the current war on Gaza, the war that's killing 14 Palestinians, civilians, every hour. It is killing Palestinian women, one Palestinian woman every 20 minutes. It is breaking the heart of parents, of children, whose houses, whose schools are being bombarded every 15 minutes. What would a Palestinian mother say to her child when he asks for water and there is no water? This child, if he survives, would he remember the following sentence, that normally depriving you of food, of medication, is a war crime, but you are Palestinian. That means that the international law does not serve you. Esteemed colleagues, enough with the war, enough with the despair, enough with the oppression, enough with the killing, enough with the violence, and enough with double standards in the application of international law. To our friends that seem to think that they would serve Israel in its war against Gaza, they would think that their humanitarian and legal responsibility towards the Palestinian are being borne by calls, late calls, to deliver humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza. To those we say, in all honesty, your position that is supportive of Israel will not serve Israel and will not convince Palestinians. Whoever wants to support Israel would support the end of this war, would support a just and comprehensive peace. Whoever wants to bear their responsibility towards Palestinians must stop any killing of Palestinians, must support just and comprehensive peace, to establish an independent Palestinian state, a sovereign state with Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem, as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, so that every Palestinian and Israeli mother would be happy with the smiles on the faces of their children, so that Children can hug their parents out of joy, not out of fear. Esteemed colleagues, condemning the killing of Palestinian and Israeli civilians, calling for liberty for everyone is a very important humanitarian position. We have taken this position. Violence is born out of the death of hope, or born out of any other motive that would completely undermine justice. Any attempt to forcibly displace Palestinians inside their occupied land or outside of this occupied land is a war crime according to the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 and its protocol of 1977. Any attempt to export this crisis that is made by the occupation, that is aggravated by the occupation, that will only end with the end of the occupation, any forced displacement to neighboring countries, we will confront these attempts. Ladies and gentlemen, 6,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed. Those have faces, have memories, have loved ones. 200,000 homes were destroyed. 200 schools in Gaza turned into rubble. Hospitals, schools, places of worship were bombarded. To target civilians taking shelter in those buildings, not for self-defense. We will not allow for fury, for anger, for pain to determine our future. That will only beget more fury, more pain. Israel will enjoy security when Palestinians enjoy security. How many wars have we seen? How many civilians have paid the price? And where we are today, in the midst of another hell of a war that portends grave repercussions for our region. Ladies and gentlemen, only the just peace would secure Israel's and Palestine's security. Wrong are those who promote the possibility of achieving peace by ignoring the Palestinian people. The crisis has become deeper because there are no prospects for ending occupation. There are some in the Israeli leadership that are destroying the prospect of the two-state solution. Some are calling for wiping the Palestinian people out of the face of the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, the Security Council should adopt a resolution for ceasefire and to stop the war. The Security Council should adopt a resolution to condemn the killing of the Palestinians, of civilians on both sides, to prevent starving Palestinians, to prevent collective punishment. The Security Council must take a clear stance that reassure 2 billion Arabs and Muslims that international law will be applied. Let's work together to ensure that this is the last war on Gaza, the last violence in Palestine and Israel, the last instance of demonizing Palestinians, the last tears of mothers over the futile death of their children. Let's work together to go back to a true peace process, to seriously work together, to go back to a true peace process, to serious negotiations based on international law, based on Security Council resolutions that remain ink on paper, to end the occupation, to achieve comprehensive, durable, just peace on the basis of the two-state resolution within a set time frame with international guarantees. Peace for the Palestinians, peace for the Israelis, peace for the whole region. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in the same situation we've been in for years. Year after year, we are talking without any action on the ground to achieve peace. Innocent civilians are being killed. Hope is being dissipated, and the credibility of the United Nations is being eroded. The value of international peace is reduced. This Council must champion the law and justice and humanity. Or it says Israel has the right to do what any other country has not the right to do. And the Palestinian people do not enjoy the same rights as any other people. The war would become even more ferocious. It is up to you. The whole world will benefit if the Security Council championed justice and peace. Or the Council would bear the responsibility of this war, of depriving a whole people of the right to live like all other peoples of the world, live in security, liberty, independence on their land, on the land of Palestine, on the land of the ancestors. I thank you for your attention. May the blessings of God be upon you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Safadi for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sameh Shoukry, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Palestinian territories are going through horrific developments. The number of victims of Israeli military action on Gaza exceeded 5,000. Innocent Palestinian civilians, among them more than 2,000 children, in a matter of 3 weeks. The war machine continues indiscriminately to claim lives without any distinction. Despite this humanitarian shock and the loss of lives around the clock, it is regrettable, it is shameful that some continue to justify what is happening, citing the right to self-defense and resisting terrorism. I wonder today, what right justifies not distinguishing between an enemy to be targeted and unarmed civilians destined to live for centuries in this particular part of their homeland and to be subjected to a blockade? 2.5 million civilians are being killed, starved, and forcibly displaced. The scenes of this crisis since its beginning have been heart-wrenching. The children that lost their lives, or lost their mothers, or their siblings, or their fathers, do not deserve what's happening to them. They're not responsible for what is happening to them. Our conscience cannot bear their suffering. Silence, in this case, is tantamount to giving blessings, not naming things by their names and merely calling for respecting international humanitarian law without describing what is happening as an actual violation of international humanitarian law and human rights that lip service is paid to. All this is tantamount to participating in the crimes, reducing the suffering of the Palestinian people that has been going on for 7 decades to the circumstances of the last chapter of this suffering is an attempt to justify flagrant violations of international law and international humanitarian law. They are tantamount to giving the green light to perpetuating unprecedented suffering inflicted on the people of Gaza. Mr. President, Egypt has condemned the targeting of civilians, any civilians. I repeat and reaffirm once again that Egypt does not accept any targeting of unarmed civilians by any party or capturing them for them to become a bargaining chip. We do not accept any justification in this regard. We call for releasing the captured. Humanity is indivisible and is not selective. Some are busy with playing the blame game, while destruction and death continue unabated. Those need to recognize that today's situation did not come from nothing. It is a result of accumulated practices and policies with the sole goal of entrenching an illegal occupation, usurping the land from its rightful owners, and imposing a new demographic reality. Egypt has warned time and again of merely timidly calling for reviving the peace process, of inaction of the international community, not using the tools at its disposal to enforce international consensus on the settlement of the Palestinian questions based on a two-state solution, and Security Council resolutions. We've also warned at several occasions of the continued and intensified Israeli practices lately, especially persisting in weakening the Palestinian Authority, saying that peace is no longer feasible. The policies of separating the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the blockade on the Strip, the storming by the Israeli military of the towns of the West Bank, desecrating holy places, Israel reneging on any understandings to de-escalate the situation on the ground, all of the above led us to this desperate moment. Mr. President, Security Council and General Assembly resolutions over the history of the crisis reflected an unequivocal and clear unanimity that the Palestinian question needs to be settled, not liquidated by military action or settlement, or by what we're seeing today, namely forced displacement. I reiterate what Egypt has stated during the Cairo Peace Summit, that the solution to the Palestinian question is not forced displacement, not moving the Palestinian people to other places. The only solution is justice, by granting the Palestinians their legitimate rights in self-determination, in living in dignity and peace and safety in their independent state on their territories, just like any other people in the world. The Palestinian people will not leave its land. It's holding on to this land. Egypt will not accept for the Palestinian people to be forcibly displaced, and we will not accept any liquidation of the Palestinian question at Egypt's expense. A look at history clearly reveals that the Palestinian people, despite the challenges, remained resistant on its territory, and the Palestinian questions throughout the history also did not die. It too remained resistant, given the legitimate demands of the Palestinian people and their rights that are beyond disputes. What has the world gained as a result of deferring the solution? More tension, more pain in occupied Palestine, in Israel, and in the whole region. Mr. President, we followed with regret the inability of this august council twice to adopt a resolution or even to call for a ceasefire to end this war. In light of this crisis situation, we're also surprised by new attempts to adopt resolutions that don't include any call for a ceasefire to prevent any further deterioration of the situation, which might lead the region to a dangerous juncture with grave repercussions. What is being tabled, some of what's being tabled today in the Council, amounts to a new attempt to justify the continuation of this war. This is not in line with the Charter of the United Nations that established this Council and determined its mandate. Egypt provided a platform for heads of states and government through the Cairo Peace that was held on the 21st of this month to contain the situation and to provide a political framework to deal with this crisis, rather than giving free rein to destruction, killing, and violence. At this summit, we pursued an approach that is not politicized, that takes into account the urgent humanitarian dimension of this catastrophe. We aimed at reaching a consensus, even if just in principle, on a de-escalation to stop the war and to prevent more destruction, to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid and revive the peace process. We will not rest until this war ends. However, to be very honest, we regret the double standards we've seen since the beginning of this crisis when dealing with international crisis, especially the humanitarian dimension. Some rush to show sympathy with civilian victims in certain places and condemn in the strongest terms possible those responsible for civilian casualties. At the same time, they prefer to turn a blind eye and rush to justify the killing and the targeting of civilians and their civilian infrastructure in a different place, as if the lives of civilians in Palestine mattered less than the lives of others, as if Palestinian lives did not deserve the same efforts to protect them and to defend them. Mr. President, I came today representing Egypt, which opened the door for peace in the region, to warn of the grave repercussions of international failure to deal with the current crisis and its repercussions on peace in the region and the aspirations of the peoples of the region to peace, coexistence, and stability. And I ask you today, before it's too late, given that the Council is the highest political body entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security, I'll call you to do the following. 1, sustainable and immediate ceasefire in Gaza without any conditions. 2nd, put an end to all the practices that aim to forcibly displace the Palestinian people in their land or outside their land, which is a grave violation of international law, humanitarian international law, and amounts to a war crime. 3, provide international protection immediately to the unarmed Palestinian people. 4th, ensure the safe, prompt, and sustainable delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Israel must bear its responsibilities as the occupying power. 5, we must reach a binding formula to settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict according to the agreed-upon parameters set out in Security Council resolutions, which provide for the end of the occupation and establish a Palestinian state along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. 6, this council must bear its responsibility and work on launching an independent investigation of the flagrant violations of international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the above is the least we would expect of this august council. The main body responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security before the current crisis worsens even further, before it spills over to other countries of the region, before we have to go back to this council to discuss a deeper and a bigger crisis, before it is too late. I thank you, Mr. President. May the peace, blessings, and mercy of God be upon you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Shukri for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Petrus Shatto, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for giving me the floor. Unfortunately, I do believe it's not an exaggeration to say that global security has been in its worst shape since the conclusion of the Cold War. And the two armed conflicts, which are now having the biggest impact, negative one of course, on global security, have been taking place in Europe and in our direct neighborhood. And this phenomenon makes us in Europe facing a tremendous challenge. In such an occasion, for which this Council has now been convened, we have to speak very clearly and nothing must be relativized. Therefore, we have to say very clearly that there is no excuse and there can be no excuse for launching thousands of rockets on the territory of a sovereign country. And there's no excuse and there can be no excuse for killing a big number of innocent people by such an attack. Therefore, we do find unacceptable all kinds of attempts which aim at explaining this phenomenon or aim at putting it into any kind of context or aim at finding any excuse for such a barbarian attack. And based on that, we have to say also very clearly that Israel does definitely have the right to protect itself. It's not only the interest of Israel, but the interest of the entire international community that such an attack will never ever take place again. And dear Mr. President, on this occasion we have to call everything by its name. A terrorist attack has been committed against Israel. A terrorist attack committed by a terrorist organization. So therefore, what has to happen now is a fight against terror and fight against a terrorist organization. And I do believe I can say that it is the interest of all of us that this fight against terror will be successful. In the meantime, we have to be also very clear about the fact that, or the intention, that in the meantime, all efforts should be made by the international community to make sure that escalation is avoided. And when I say escalation is avoided, I mean that it must be avoided that this fight against terror this fight against a terrorist organization must not turn into a war between nations and between countries. And here I'd like to share two major concerns of ours with you, Mr. President. First, that after a series of failures for long decades, and after people of this region suffering a lot, a new hope for a long-term peace has popped up back in 2020 when the Abraham Accords have been signed in the garden of the White House. That was the first successful attempt to create a long-lasting and sustainable peace. And here I definitely do believe that we have to pay tribute to President Trump, who was able to put together the Abraham Accords. And we have to pay special tribute to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, who have participated at the signing of the first agreements. And here, Mr. President, unfortunately, we see a huge risk posed by the series of terrorist attacks against Israel, that all the achievements we have reached since 2020, since signing the Abraham Accords, will be lost. And that these terrorist attacks will bring us back to a similarly hopeless situation where we had been for decades. Therefore, Mr. President, we do count a lot on the Gulf countries and on the Arab countries in the region, who have shown a very responsible way of behavior, not to let all these achievements reached by the Abraham Accords be lost. And the second concern I'd like to raise, Mr. President, is that for us in Hungary, I have to tell you honestly, it's scary. It's scary to see images from the streets and squares of some European countries and here in North America. We see that terrorist organizations are being praised on the streets. We see that rallies take place in order to praise acts of terror. And we see a modern age anti-Semitism being on the rise in some European countries. And I have to tell you that this we find unacceptable and frightening in the meantime. And we all know that this is a consequence of the massive illegal migratory flows which have hit Europe in the recent years and which have created parallel societies in many European countries. And we all know that in case this conflict in the Middle East escalates, we Europeans will have to face another tremendous and very dangerous waves of illegal migration. So therefore, Mr. President, I want to make it very clear here as a conclusion that it is absolutely unimaginable that any authority in Hungary would approve and allow any rally to take place with the goal of praising a terrorist attack or a terrorist organization. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Sujato, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Naledi Pandor, Minister for International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to begin by thanking the Federative Republic of Brazil for convening this timely open debate. We found the briefings this morning most instructive. They provided terrible insights into the plight of innocent civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as pointed to the urgent need to ensure the release of Israeli hostages as soon as possible. South Africa agrees with many of today's speakers that the ultimate solution to the conflict is finalizing the question of the two-state solution. We must work hard through the United Nations to create two states, Palestine and Israel, living side by side in peace and security. This must be done in accord with the established UN resolutions on the two-state solution. The Palestinian state should be created along the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. South Africa also joins the urgent calls for an immediate comprehensive ceasefire, and that humanitarian corridors should be opened so that aid and other basic services reach all those in need. Most importantly, we call on all parties to exercise restraint and to desist from fueling this patently unjust war and suffering of innocents. Mr. President, we also express condolences to the people of Palestine and of Israel for the lives lost during the past 2 weeks. We are horrified at the blatant targeting of civilians, a clear violation of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, and its protocols. Both Hamas and the State of Israel have committed these violations. Chairperson, the killing of civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza by Israeli forces goes against the tenets of international law, which prohibits the targeting of non-combatants, especially women, the aged, and children. There is an added obligation on an occupying power over the people and territory it occupies in terms of the Geneva Conventions, including a prohibition against collective punishment. This, of course, does not detract from South Africa's concern at the actions of Hamas, which also targeted non-combatants. Whilst we express concern at the current violence and deaths, we cannot ignore the fact that continued occupation has bred hatred, suffering, and pain. Just as Israel deserves peace and security, so are Palestinians deserving of sovereignty, peace, and security. It is our view that for international law to be credible, it must be applied uniformly and not be selective. Mr. President, in our view, the conflict has again illustrated the inadequacy of our own global organization, this body, the United Nations, and in particular, this Council, which has the mandate of maintaining international peace and security. The Council has clearly not been able over time to prevent conflicts from spiraling into intense violence and harm to ordinary civilians. All of us need to work harder at reforming our organization so that it is more capable of responding in protection of civilians. We all recall that in 1994, a genocide occurred in Rwanda with much of the whole world watching as innocent people were massacred. History cannot keep repeating such cruelty with all of us watching. We should establish a system of global governance that is fair, equitable, and has the capacity to respond to the needs of all persons in situations of threat and harm. A system that is not just a tool for the most powerful countries of the world, but that provides protection for the most vulnerable. Finally, South Africa is appalled at the Security Council's failure to agree a unified resolution that signals a full commitment to ending killing and suffering. There can be no search for compromise resolutions when this Council is faced with a crisis of such proportions. We thus urge the Council to do its work and ensure security and peace for the residents of Israel and of Gaza. I thank you, Chairperson.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Pandor, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Highness Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Your Excellency, President of the Security Council, Excellencies, we hold this meeting under painful circumstances following dangerous developments in the Gaza Strip that claimed the lives of thousands of civilians. It warns of an imminent humanitarian catastrophe and dangerous repercussions on the security of the region and the world. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia condemned clearly the targeting of civilians, whoever they may be. We have called for ending the escalation of military operations, to stop the bloodshed, to release hostages, to abide by international laws and conventions. We also made every effort alongside friendly and brotherly nations in order to find an urgent and practical solution to stop the bloodshed, to put an end to the escalation, and the ongoing cycle of violence. The Palestinian people is suffering under blockade and the ongoing escalation of the Israeli war machine. They continue to target its civilian facilities, its schools, hospitals, infrastructure. They have claimed the lives of thousands of civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. They have injured thousands of civilians. The failure of the international community to this very day to end this collective punishment by the Israeli occupation forces against the residents of Gaza, their attempts to forcibly displace them, this will not bring us any closer to security and stability. As your Council remains silent before these crises that have been ongoing for decades, this is unacceptable. This Council bears the responsibility of its complacency, the cost of this crisis, the losses in lives and property, and the threats to the security and stability of the region. Maintaining international peace and security is at the forefront of the functions of this Council. However, today we see that it is unable to carry out its role. It is late in reaching a resolution that would address this crisis as Israel continues with its violations of international conventions, including international humanitarian law. This casts doubt on the credibility of the mechanisms of international legitimacy. It is high time for the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility for which it was established. The international community must take a firm stance to end military operations, to guarantee the protection of civilians, to end the blockade, to guarantee the delivery of humanitarian assistance, to provide medicine, food, and water, to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, to prevent expanding the cycle of conflict. Double standards and selectivity in abiding by UN laws and resolutions. This policy has dangerous repercussions that go beyond this crisis. It impacts the rules of international law. It also impacts our ability to maintain international peace and security. Mr. President, we have warned time and again that this ongoing escalation with the lack of accountability, this will lead to further violence, further destruction. It will lead to further extremism. The ongoing cycles of violence is because UN resolutions were not respected, were not implemented. If we ignore the reasons behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this will not lead to a just solution. It will not achieve peace and security in the region. We need to seriously revive the peace process that is credible. We are working for the future of our region, a better future for our region. We do hope that the region will enjoy peace, that prosperity will be guaranteed for all, and a better future will be guaranteed for the peoples of the region and succeeding generations. This is the peace that we aspire to, a sustainable peace that would guarantee the two-state solution and the establishment of a Palestinian state along the lines of 1967 that would achieve security, stability, and prosperity for all. I thank you.
I thank His Highness Prince Faisal for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Jean Asselborn, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. Thank you for having invited me to participate in this open debate. Nothing can justify the atrocities committed by Hamas terrorists and Islamic Jihad against Israeli civilians on the 7th of October. This barbarity that has shaken the world is something we condemn in the strongest terms. Luxembourg reaffirms unequivocally Israel's right to defend itself within the framework of international law. At the same time, I wish to refer to President Biden, who called on Israel to not let themselves be guided by rage, recalling that the United States had made mistakes in their reaction to the terrorist attacks on the 11th of September 2001. That means that Israel must act fully in line with international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of civilians. The population of Gaza is not Hamas. They can't be held responsible, nor can they be collectively punished for crimes committed by terrorists. The Secretary-General appealed for de-escalation and a humanitarian ceasefire. At first stage, humanitarian pauses should be established, which could then lead to a ceasefire. This would allow delivery of emergency humanitarian aid, and it would facilitate the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and it would allow also and above all to keep the civilian population of Gaza safe. Rapid and unhindered humanitarian access must be re-established without delay. We welcome the first deliveries of humanitarian assistance to those living in the Gaza Strip in recent days, and we thank the Secretary-General, Egypt, and also the United States for having facilitated the safe passage of this cargo. Nevertheless, as the United Nations has underscored, the population in Gaza need humanitarian assistance that is sustainable and that covers all people in need. As we heard this morning, the first deliveries of emergency assistance did not yet contain fuel, which is, however, nevertheless essential to allow hospitals to work and for water desalination. United Nations premises and all hospitals, clinics and schools must never be targeted by parties to the conflict. UNRWA, who's currently hosting more than 600,000 people in the Gaza Strip, and other humanitarian agencies on the ground must urgently receive the support that they need to fulfill their mandate. On our side, Luxembourg decided to contribute €2.5 million additionally to humanitarian efforts in Gaza in the region, supporting UNRWA, the World Food Programme and the ICRC. This brings our support to around €12 million for 2023. I visited Gaza on several occasions during my ministerial mandate. Gaza has been for years an open sky prison, and the conditions faced by the people are extreme. The civilians of Gaza are suffering on two fronts, from the Israeli blockade and the bombing, and also the fact that Hamas is using them as human shields. There is a serious risk that this conflict becomes a regional conflagration. This is also true for the West Bank, where the increase of the violence, as we know, of the part of settlers and the forced transfer of Palestinian communities has reached alarming levels. Any spillover of the conflict must absolutely be avoided. We must work concertedly within the international community and with the main actors in the region to avoid any escalation, and the Security Council, but also the General Assembly here in New York, have a key responsibility in this regard. The international community must urgently relaunch the peace process in the Middle East and give it all the attention it merits. The initiative for a peace day for the Middle East, which was held here in New York in September, was indeed a first step in this direction. Luxembourg remains committed to a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which ensures that Israel's right to security is respected, as well respecting the right of Palestinians to self-determination and dignity. Comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution within the 1967 borders, with two democratic states living side by side and maintaining the status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem, is the only viable path towards putting an end to the cycle of violence. Security Council Resolution 2334, adopted in December 2016, recalled this. Let us commit, President, resolutely to this path on behalf of our common humanity, a humanity that we share with Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Asselborn, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Retno Marsudi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, I flew 21 hours from Jakarta to attend this meeting. I just want to remind the Council that you have a big responsibility to maintain peace and security, not to prolong war, not to back up any side, to continue war. Indonesia condemned the continuing unprecedented aggression against civilians by Israel in Gaza. We are seeing a humanitarian catastrophe. Crimes against humanity are happening as we speak. Are we going to stand idle? Attacking hospitals, religious places, blocking access to power, water, fuel, and displacing population of the Gaza Strip are being conducted as a collective punishment. At the same time, civilian hostages are being held, their lives are in critical danger. So I come here to ask the Council, how are you going to exercise your responsibility? When are you going to stop the war in Gaza, create ceasefire, open access to humanitarian assistance, call for immediate release of civilians, stop the illegal occupation of Israel? I have to repeat it. Stop the illegal occupation of Israel. Every second wasted due to political disagreement and failure for consensus represent a humanitarian defeat for the Palestinians and creates further instability for the world. How many more lives should perish before this August Council make a move? Because I can assure you one thing, Indonesia will not waste any single second in harnessing global support for immediate action. Through the OIC, ASEAN, the ASEAN GCC, and D8 meetings, Indonesia has pushed for a united voice to urge for the cessation of violence and focus on tackling the urgent humanitarian catastrophe. Mr. President, Indonesia calls the Council on 3 points. First, a united call for an immediate ceasefire. Silence is harrowing against deafening sound and bullets and rockets. Blanket support shown to one side has so far led to further disproportionate use of force, violation of international humanitarian law, and impunity. It is our collective obligation to end the cycle of violence before it escalates into a regional and global calamity. Second, prioritization of humanitarian access. More than 2 million people in Gaza are hanging on to their lives for basic humanitarian needs. Convoys of aid delivery are mostly being held immobilized and in constant danger from crossfire. The Security Council must urge immediately for safe and unimpeded passage of humanitarian access and respect toward humanitarian law. Third, move beyond politics. Bring back humanity to the Security Council. Please use your great power to be more human. The Palestinians deserve equal rights and treatments. We are all human beings. We all deserve to have a home. We must reject the displacement of Palestinians. We must not let the 1948 tragedy reoccur. The Security Council holds great power, and with great power comes great responsibility to address the current situation in Gaza, to address the root cause and ensure a path to state solution. Indonesia stands with the people of Palestine. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Marsudi, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Francisco André, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start by commending your presidency of the Security Council for this month. Brazil has shown responsible and constructive leadership when it was most needed, in the aftermath of Hamas' ruthless and indiscriminate terrorist attacks against Israel and amid ongoing humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip. Let me also reaffirm Portugal's unequivocal condemnation of the terrorist attacks by Hamas, solidarity with Israel, and recognition of Israel's right and duty to its citizens to emulate the threat posed by Hamas' lethal capabilities. Terrorism in all its forms should be condemned, and I will be very clear, hostages must be released immediately and without preconditions. At the same time, Israel's actions must strictly respect international humanitarian law, no matter how rightful its war aims are. Mr. President, we cannot remain indifferent to the suffering of innocent victims, Israelis, Palestinians, and other nationalities, including UN workers. The death toll on both sides is staggering. At this moment, our collective priority should be the protection of civilians and addressing the humanitarian situation on the ground. The increase in Palestinian civilian suffering is not acceptable. We therefore call for the protection of all medical facilities, schools, and other critical and civilian infrastructures. The basic tenets of international humanitarian law are not compatible with shutting off electricity, food, water, and fuel from Gaza. Preventing further loss of life is a pressing priority. Collective punishment of civilian populations is contrary to international humanitarian law. We are witnessing a humanitarian catastrophe, which is increasing every day. We must act swiftly. Portugal supports and seconds Secretary-General's António Guterres' call for humanitarian ceasefire. We commend the UN work on the ground and pay our respects to those who died in the service of UNRWA and support Secretary-General tireless advocacy for aid to reach the population of Gaza. The first aid trucks must be just the beginning of a larger effort and of a safe and sustained humanitarian access. Mr. President, this is a moment of tragedy and crisis, and we must transform it into a moment of hope and opportunity, and to do so, we must recognize the nature and the complexity of the issues at stake. Despite the high expectations of the Oslo Accords 3 decades ago, the Palestinian people have not been granted statehood, millions have been displaced for generations, and indeed continue to be uprooted in contemporary times. It must be demonstrated that the non-violent political path is the path worth following. We must return to the diplomatic track. It is the only way to break this cycle of violence and extremism, and we all must work to that end, at the forefront of those directly concerned, such as neighboring countries. The recent Peace Summit in Egypt was a relevant initiative allowing for needed dialogue and coordination. Now we must urgently avoid the risks of a broader spread of this conflict, which should be prevented at all costs. With tensions running high, a spark can ignite a regional conglomeration. We welcome and encourage the continuation of regional international efforts, both in multilateral and bilateral spheres, to prevent the spillover. Mr. President, we must also look to the future. Once this war is over, we cannot just go back to the status quo ex ante. It is our collective responsibility to address the structural drivers of this conflict. Sober, yet courageous, political leadership at all levels is needed. Leadership that can show the path towards political and diplomatic dialogue. This will require a renewed involvement of all relevant actors and a determined effort to implement the UN Security Council resolutions on the matter and set a clear and solid path to a Palestinian state fulfilling the two-state solution. This is the only way towards a lasting and sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Andrea, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, Minister for Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad of Algeria.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful and all-compassionate. Thank you, President. My delegation is very grateful to yours. Thank you for taking this initiative to convene this special meeting of the Security Council and these exceptional circumstances that has raised the topic of the Palestinian question to the level it is today, and that's what we are discussing. Today, this is happening because of two phenomena, which have led to the situation's exacerbation. These two phenomena are, firstly, the marginalization almost completely of the Palestinian cause and its devaluation on the international level, and secondly, the unjustifiable tolerance of the Israeli occupation. In addition to this, the absolute immunity accorded to the Israeli occupation. This is unrestricted and unconditional immunity. Here we're talking about the marginalization of the Palestinian question. The marginalization of the Palestinian cause means that this cause has completely disappeared from the international community's priorities, and this international community has its resolutions and promises and vis-à-vis the creation of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with Jerusalem as its capital. The marginalization of the Palestinian question also means that this cause has not seen any serious initiative happen since the 1990s. This period where we saw the paralysis of international diplomacy for more than 3 decades. This also means that the Palestinian cause has recently fallen foul of a very dangerous illusion, an illusion that peace, security and stability is being sought in the Middle East on the ruins of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and on their national state. I would like to share a few comments, particularly when we talk about criticisms of the immunity accorded to the Palestinian occupation. I would like to recall that this immunity has given way to more occupation, has led to more occupation, the annexation of Palestinian land by force and control over more than 78% of the territory of the West Bank. This is a cost that has negative effects on the two-state project as a framework for a peaceful, just and sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We would also recall that this immunity, according to Israel, has given rise to more racist policies that we reject, policies that reach the occupied town, city of Jerusalem, and its policies that seek to change the legal status quo and historic status quo within the larger project of the Judaization of Jerusalem by force. We recall that this immunity has led to more deaths, forced displacement of thousands, tens of thousands of Palestinians, and this has led to the destruction of its infrastructure, its housing, and its crucial infrastructure over the last 2 decades. To conclude, I'm sure you know that this immunity has led to the creation of Israeli administrations unlike previous one, and they are rushing to carry out more barbarity, more extremism. There is competition that we're seeing for settlement expansion and to violate the rights of the Palestinian people and destroy the project of a Palestinian state. Today, we're seeing a new chapter, a catastrophic one in the Israeli occupation. It is an unprecedented chapter because of its bloody and destructive nature, as well as the horrible toll that this occupation is having against this unarmed, and it is people whose rights are violated. They have been deprived of means of subsistence, and they are people who have no prospects and whose hopes have been destroyed. Today, we are seeing a limpid situation, a very clear situation, which there's no room for interpretation. The Palestinian people is faced with a very difficult choice. On the one hand, they could choose to leave their territory and their legitimate rights behind, and the other choice is ethnic cleansing, racial cleansing, and the eradication of the project of a national Palestinian state. President, these events put the UN, its principles and its values before a significant test. We need to ensure that a logic of law prevails and not the logic of force, and also the logic of legality and not double standards. It is the legally binding criteria must be respected, and we must move against the logic of impunity and tolerance to these crimes, particularly when we talk about this Israeli colonialist occupation. In this connection and in the for the short term, we call on your council take the following measures. Firstly, lift the unjust blockade on the Gaza Strip, because this is a war crime, a crime against humanity. Secondly, we call on the Council to put an end to the senseless bombing that has led to thousands of innocent victims. This is also a war crime, a crime of genocide. Thirdly, forced displacement of Palestinian people must end. This could also be seen as a crime of ethnic cleansing. And fourthly, we must allow humanitarian assistance to be delivered to the people in Gaza without restriction or condition. This is an appeal that we repeat here before your Council. In the long term, I would like to touch on the topic of a political solution. Here we call on the Security Council to be aware of a clear, obvious reality. Lasting peace cannot be based on crime and injustice. Lasting peace can't be built on marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination. Lasting peace in the Middle East can only be built on a just and lasting solution to the Palestinian question within the framework of international law. And the principles and content of this have been developed here, were developed here at the United Nations in this building, at the Security Council. The Security Council, would they accept to not implement 87 resolutions that have been adopted since the start of this conflict just because the occupying force has decided not to respect them? Your august council, would they accept for these resolutions just to stay within these walls and for a state to be above the law? Would your august assembly accept the violations of all its resolutions on Palestine? For one reason, the occupier would like this legal requirements to be optional. Clearly, we are at a watershed moment, which reaffirms, once again, the specific responsibility of the Security Council. This body should shoulder its responsibilities to the full. Thank you very much, President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Attaf for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmet Yildiz, Deputy Foreign Minister for Middle East and North Africa Affairs of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Turkey joins others in thanking the Brazilian presidency for organizing this open debate. It is a timely meeting as one of the greatest tragedies of recent history is unfolding in front of our eyes. As we speak here, innocent Palestinian people in Gaza, with a population of 2.5 million, squeezed in a very tiny territory, are under constant and indiscriminate bombing. No hospitals, schools, or places of worship became a shelter for them as Israeli missiles continue targeting them regardless of where they are or whether they are sick or wounded. As of today, the Israeli military has killed more Palestinian children since October 7 than it did in all other military Israeli offensives on Gaza since 2006 combined. the number of the children killed is fast approaching 2,000. There can be no justification for the collective punishment of civilians in Gaza. Some prefer to look the other way in face of such atrocities. They prefer not to speak about crimes against humanity and war crimes. They prefer to pretend as if Palestinian people are just numbers and they have no souls and rights. This is absolutely unacceptable. This is sheer hypocrisy and embodiment of double standard that constitutes the very root cause of the problem we are facing today. If we continue treading the same path, today's problems between Israel and Palestine will only increase in magnitude. We urge immediate action to prevent the conflict from spilling over the wider region and beyond. Therefore, for us, what needs to be done is crystal clear. First, cessation of hostilities must be achieved through an immediate, unconditional, and lasting ceasefire. Second, unhindered flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza must absolutely be ensured. To this end, I hope this Council will enforce keeping Rafah crossing open for steady flow of humanitarian assistance. Third, the two parties, Israel and Palestine, must be brought together to agree on a two-state solution, living side by side in secure and pre-67 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Palestine. It is true that such a vision for settlement remained elusive despite several serious attempts. What is required now is a guarantee mechanism for monitoring, verifying, and when needed, enforcing the obligations of the parties. Otherwise, what is written on papers runs the risk of remaining on the papers as happened till now. Turkey is ready to assume its role for regional ownership together with other regional countries. Mr. President, the responsibility of stopping this bloodshed and starting a meaningful process for peace lies first and foremost with the Security Council. The last time this body spoke with one voice and agreed on a resolution regarding Gaza was in January 2009. Resolution 1860 was adopted at a time with Turkey's contributions as a member of the Security Council. We urge the Council to put an end to its indifference to this ongoing carnage, which can have no place in the 21st century. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Yildiz, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. A cry of agony can be heard across the Middle East. You can hear the cry in Israel, where families mourn the loved ones, killed, tortured, brutally abducted by Hamas terrorists. You can hear it in Gaza, where parents fear for the lives of their children. You can hear the cry in neighboring countries, where families worry about the violence spilling over to them. Here in this room, we hear the cry. If we want the agony to stop, we must heed all these cries, knowing that it will only stop if it stops for everyone. This conflict is testing us, the world community. Each of us looks at this conflict from our own perspective and history. We need to respect that. But if we want to find a way out of this crisis, we cannot stop there. We must seek to understand each other's pain. Imagine what it would feel like if our sister were abducted, if our child were hit by a missile. We must hear each other out. Then we need to see how we can take small but courageous steps to end the suffering together. I speak to you as the foreign minister of a country that bears historic responsibility for the worst imaginable crime, the crime committed by Nazi Germany, the Shoah. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews with the aim of eradicating Jewish life from Europe. Never again. To me, as a German, that means that we will not rest knowing that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are now being held hostage by terrorists in Gaza. For Germany, Israel's security is non-negotiable. Like any other state in the world, Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorism within the framework of international law. Addressing the plight of the Palestinians is in no way contradicting this clear and unwavering stance. It is a key part of it. In Israel, I was shown videos of the most horrendous brutalities against human beings that one could possibly imagine, of young girls being thrown onto trucks as hostages, imagining if they were your children. All hostages must be released immediately, and I thank all partners who are working on it non-stop. In Jordan, I met Palestinian refugee families, schoolgirls, who told me that 53 of their family and friends have been killed in Gaza over the past few days. 53. Each of them someone's daughter, someone's son. Imagine if they were your daughter, your son. All civilian lives matter just the same. Humanity is universal, and so should be our empathy. The fight is against Hamas and not against civilians. That is why it's crucial for us that this fight must be carried out in line with humanitarian law, with the greatest possible consideration for civilians in Gaza. That is why my country, Germany, is increasing our humanitarian aid to Gaza by 50 million euro, of which 19 million go to UNRWA. That is why we need humanitarian windows so that those who are suffering can get help in Gaza. In doing so, we must not be fooled by Hamas' playbook. Hamas is playing with human suffering, using women and children in Gaza as human shields, hiding its weapons under supermarkets, apartment blocks, even hospitals, with obvious intent. Their plan is to fan the flames of hatred and violence, to spark regional escalation, to tear us apart as a world community. We can choose to see the conflict through our own eyes only, to give in to grief and anger, or we can move ahead together, small as our steps may be, so that Hamas can never again perpetrate such acts of terror. The rules of the UN Charter and the international humanitarian law should guide our work for a new tomorrow, towards a meaningful peace process, allowing both Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security in two independent states, knowing that peace will only work if it works for everyone. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Baerbock, for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Hanke Bruin-Slot, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. Mr. President, on the 7th of October, the world witnessed a horrific terrorist attack on Israel. The horrendous violence carried out by Hamas was not aimed at military targets. Rather, it was an attempt to destroy people's souls by taking hostages and murdering civilians. And this threat from Hamas is far from over. In this context, we should stand all united by supporting Israel and its right to self-defense against the terror threat of Hamas. As we have said before, the use of force in self-defense must be necessary and proportionate, and international humanitarian law must be respected by all parties. This means that every possible measure to protect civilians must be taken. The humanitarian workers must be able to do their job safely and unhindered, and that the UN premises and personnel remain safe from harm. All of this requires restraint on the part of Israel in the use of force. Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands shares the concerns voiced by so many today. The situation for civilians in Gaza is catastrophic. They are in dire need of aid, and we cannot lose to afford more time. So far, the first convoys have entered Gaza. We need a sustained flow of humanitarian aid of all basic needs, and much more is needed, including fuel. Water supplies need to be restored immediately. Humanitarian pauses are crucial to allow much-needed aid to get through. And a permanent humanitarian corridor is the only way to prevent the situation getting much worse. The Netherlands will step up its humanitarian response. We have committed an additional 10 million euros for immediate humanitarian relief, 8 million euros of which is for UNRWA. This funding aims to improve the living conditions for Palestinian citizens, including mental health and psychosocial support. We are also extremely concerned about the conflict spreading beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza. And we call on all concerned to prevent this from happening. We also urge all parties to do their utmost to prevent further escalation in the West Bank. In this context, we will continue with our development aid for stability. The Palestinian Authority fulfills an important role within their power in preventing a further deterioration and deserves our strong support. Settler violence is worsening an already tense situation, and this must stop. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by saying that our thoughts and prayers are with all the victims and hostages that need to be released immediately and unconditionally. When the UN was created in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was one of the first major crises calling for urgent attention. Today, more than 75 years later, the need to find a solution to this conflict is more pressing and crucial than ever. The Netherlands calls on this Council to provide the leadership required to manage this crisis, contain it, and provide perspective on a sustainable peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians as the only way forward. In this context, I would like to thank the efforts of the UN and express my gratitude to the UN staff acting on the ground. We cannot go back to the status quo. The two-state solution is more urgently needed than ever, because both sides need it. Both sides are entitled to it, and both sides deserve it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Bruns-Lott, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. El-Tayar Salem El-Bour, Acting Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Libya.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Security Council. The government and people of my country condemn in the strongest terms the brutal aggression carried out by the brutal Israeli occupation forces against the Gaza Strip. This aggression has claimed the lives of over 5,000 individuals, in addition to those who were injured and the hundreds trapped under the rubble. First responders are still unable to reach them due to the shelling. And this is the objective of the Zionist occupation forces, the genocide of the residents of the city of Gaza. Mr. President, the pages of our human history are filled with details about the suffering of victims of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. They have documented the horrors of wars. These pages cannot be amended or falsified. They will not conceal the identity of those who perpetrated these horrors, their supporters, their sponsors, the crimes of colonialism, racism, the deliberate killing of young women and children, and the meaning, humanity, and terrorism. These are crimes against humanity and peaceful coexistence. No media in the world can falsify what happened in Gaza, similar to what we are witnessing with the massacre of the bombing of the Baptist Hospital, which claimed the lives of over 500 individuals. Mr. President, this aggression has shown the falsehood of slogans of human rights. Where is the concern over human rights and international law, especially from the so-called civilized nations? What kind of message are you sending today to the world? The world is fully aware of what is happening in the occupied Palestinian territory. Enough double standards, enough falsifying facts. These painful events is a natural result of the continued apartheid policies imposed by the brutal Israeli occupation forces against the Palestinian people for over 7 decades. This has led to denying the Palestinian people of their legitimate rights pursuant to international and humanitarian resolutions and conventions. We cannot accept false arguments that pretend that this current crisis started on the 7th of October and that what preceded it in terms of violations against Palestinians, desecrating the holy sites of Muslims and Christians in Jerusalem, that these were perpetrated by unknown individuals. Therefore, you cannot ask us to condemn the resistance of the Palestinian people or to remain silent and to support aggression against civilians. In this difficult time, some countries supporting this brutal aggression are asking us to accept the forced displacement of Palestinians. From where? From their homes to countries, to neighboring countries. This is a crime that you wish, a war crime that you wish to be supported by the world. Mr. President, international resolutions and international humanitarian law, these laws support and protect civilians. They are binding agreements, moral agreements. Double standards in identifying who are the civilians that should be protected at the international level and should be provided with military support. This is unacceptable. It demeans the lives of civilians. My country calls on the immediate ending of this aggression, to put an end to the brutal aggression from Israel under the pretext of protecting their citizens. We are watching on the news the declarations of the occupation forces. They wish to perpetrate a genocide against the residents of Gaza. My country calls on the international community to work on putting an end to this aggression, to put an end to their aspirations to destroy the city of Gaza and Palestinian territory. We also call on the international community to support the Palestinian people's right to establish their independent state with Jerusalem as its capital instead of creating a new geographic reality. We should not talk about the borders of 2023, and we should not talk about the right of refugees from Gaza to go back home. We will not compromise over Palestinians' right to reach food, water, and electricity. We should guarantee the delivery of humanitarian assistance to over 2 million people, and not just allow the access of 20 or 30 vehicles carrying medicine and food. The priority today is to provide security to the residents of the region, to provide an opportunity for a just peace. The Zionist occupation forces should be held accountable for disregarding international humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention. They should be held responsible for cutting off supplies of fuel, water, and electricity. If the international community is unable to put an end to these violations, then you should speak and say so. You should not consider the Palestinian resistance as an argument to allow the destruction of Gaza. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. El-Baour, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Mr. Sanja Stidlic, Deputy Foreign Minister of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank the Secretary General and the briefers for their introductory statements. We are following with great concern the current situation in the Middle East. This cycle of violence has brought additional tragedy and suffering, primarily to innocent civilians. Slovenia remains steadfast in its commitment to the principle that every life counts. This principle should guide our actions in time of peace and prosperity, and even more importantly, in times of conflict and crisis. One of the youngest visitors to the Slovenian office in Ramallah is a 6-year-old girl called Sara. She fell in love with Slovenian anthem, which speaks of nations living together in peace and coexistence, and has even learned the words in Arabic. On the other side, I have been told about children from the Kfar Aza kibbutz and the paper kites they made with their parents on Simchat Torah to send to Gaza as a wish for peace. Keeping in mind Sarah, the children of kibbutz Kfar Aza, the children of Gaza, and indeed all the children of the region, the messages that we want to convey today are simple. Firstly, Slovenia condemns in the strongest terms the terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel. The brutality and killing of innocent civilians can never be justified. We call on Hamas to stop rocket fire into Israel and release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Slovenia supports Israel's rights to self-defense in accordance with international law, including the principle of proportionality. Secondly, Slovenia calls on all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles. This includes full, immediate, and unhindered humanitarian access to and within Gaza. The civilian population there, the majority of whom are innocent women and children, should not bear the brunt of the response for the Hamas attacks for which they are not responsible. And they should not be used as human shields. Without access to water, food, medical supplies, fuel, gas, and electricity, and with constant attacks on civilian objects, schools, hospitals, and protected shelters, the situation in Gaza is turning into a human catastrophe. In this context, we join the calls for an independent investigation of the attack on Al-Ali Hospital. Thirdly, there is an urgent need for a humanitarian ceasefire or pause for the aid to be delivered and distributed to those in need in a fast, sustained, and safe manner. The first deliveries hardly respond to the immense needs on the ground. Slovenia will continue to support the indispensable work of UNRWA, and we have recently substantially increased our funding to the agency. Slovenia reiterates its full support for the work of the United Nations system and the broader humanitarian community. From the good offices of the Secretary General to the efforts of each and every medical and humanitarian worker on the ground. Many of them work tirelessly, and too many of them paid the highest price for humanity to prevail. Slovenia recognizes and supports the efforts of several states and leaders to avert the crisis and humanitarian disaster. We call on all countries in the region and beyond to act responsibly and to cooperate and engage in a constructive dialogue to de-escalate that conflict. In this context, we welcome the Cairo Peace Summit. Finally, people in the region have for decades suffered immensely. As a matter of urgency, we must recommit ourselves to resuming a meaningful peace process leading to a two-state solution that brings peace and security to both sides. Slovenia has supported and will continue to support initiatives aimed at reinforcing and reinvigorating the Middle East peace process, including the recently launched Peace Day effort. Peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis can only be achieved through a credible political process. Mr. President, as we sit in this chamber, let us think about who we want to create a better world for. To me, there is an obvious answer: for all the peoples of the region, for women, children, and men taken hostage, for those running to shelters when the alarms sound, for those who have fled their homes or are living in refugee camps and experiencing constant fear, violence, and deprivation. Today we observe United Nations Day. When the organization was established, it represented hope for global peace and unity. Those who were children when the United Nations started to deal with the Palestinian question are grandparents today. We, the international community, have failed them. But their children's children deserve a brighter future. We must make sure that their hopes, their dreams, and their aspirations are met with opportunity, peace, and security. The Security Council bears a special responsibility in this respect. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Stidlich for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gerardo Peñalver Portal, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba.
Mr. President, we endorse the statements that will be delivered by Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement and Senegal in their condition as chair of the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. We reiterate our deep concern at the escalation of violence between Israel and Palestine, a consequence of decades of Israeli practices of illegal occupation and settlement, in flagrant violation of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people on their own land, as well as the prolonged disregard for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and international law, including numerous resolutions of the United Nations. Cuba rejects and has always rejected the death of civilians and innocent people of all parties involved in this conflict, without regard to ethnicity, origin, nationality, or religious faith. We condemn in the most robust terms the assassination of civilians, especially women, children, and humanitarian workers of the United Nations system. The indiscriminate bombing against the population in Gaza and the destruction of housing, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure, as well as the denial of services such as water, food, electricity, and fuel to that population, which makes considerably worse the precarious humanitarian situation resulting from the blockade of the Gaza Strip. Nothing can justify these actions, which constitute collective punishment, serious violations of international humanitarian law, and war crimes and crimes against humanity. We demand an immediate ceasefire and the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. We must put an end to this rhetoric of war. It is shameful that, once again, the Security Council has been unable to fulfill its mandate. The government of the United States has been an accomplice and has been responsible for the impunity of Israel for its past crimes by obstructing action of this organ with regard to the Palestinian question, undermining peace and stability in the Middle East. It is shameful that the United States has, in this Security Council, vetoed 46 resolutions related to the situation in the Middle East, including the question of Palestine, the most recent of these just a few days ago. On this occasion, the crime is of greater magnitude because it makes it impossible to put an end to the humanitarian catastrophe of extreme magnitude in the Palestinian territory that is occupied and in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Therefore, it has not been possible to stop the current panorama of violence, which will only exacerbate tensions and worsen the humanitarian impact on civilians. We demand of the government of the United States that they not continue to paralyze the Security Council using the anti-democratic and obsolete power of veto in order to protect the excesses of the government of Israel. We advocate for looking for a speedy solution via negotiation that will stop this escalation of violence and its very serious humanitarian consequences. We stress the urgent need for a broad, just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of the creation of two states that will make it possible for the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination and to have an independent and sovereign state within the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and which will also guarantee the right of return for refugees. We reiterate our robust rejection of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, together with the illegal policy of annexation by Israel and all of its settlement practices. We condemn the latent plans to annex Palestinian territory in the Jordan Valley and other parts of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We urge mobilization with the coordination of the United Nations of humanitarian emergency aid to deal with the disastrous situation in Gaza, and we call upon all parties involved to facilitate the entry and distribution of this indispensable humanitarian assistance. We will continue to decisively support the State of Palestine becoming a full member of the United Nations, and we support the call of its President for the holding of an international peace conference. Mr. President, we reiterate our call for the total and unconditional withdrawal by Israel from the Syrian Golan and all other occupied Arab territories. We demand an end to foreign interference in Syria and full respect for its sovereignty and territorial integrity, as we also support the search for a peaceful and negotiated solution to the situation imposed on this sisterly Arab nation. We advocate for the preservation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, which gave precedence to the tools of multilateral diplomacy. It is regrettable that the United States has unilaterally withdrawn from the nuclear agreement that was in May of 2018, which was a clear step back and should be reconsidered as soon as possible. We support the inalienable right of all states to engage in the research, production and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. We demand an immediate and unconditional end to the arbitrary and illegal unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States against sovereign nations in the Middle East. We reiterate our call for an end to be put to these double standards, selectivity and political manipulation, which weakens the cause of international peace and security to the detriment of the mandate of the Security Council. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Peñalver Portal for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wojciech Gierlu, Undersecretary of State of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank Brazil for convening this debate. Poland follows with great concern the current devastating crisis in the Middle East. At its very onset, we condemned the brutal attacks on civilians carried out by Hamas. Terrorism aiming at the civilian population cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. Suffering of the innocent is never justified. This is why we are convinced that Israel has the right to defend itself and its citizens in compliance with the international law and international humanitarian law. We are also joining all those calling for immediate and unconditional release of all hostages taken by Hamas. Poland supports all international efforts aimed at restoring peace. The international community needs to engage with regional actors to encourage and persuade all the sides to step back. It is crucial to prevent regional escalation. Poland stands ready to support any process that would help achieve a diplomatic solution to the ongoing conflict. Distinguished delegates, it is our common duty to ensure humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians in Gaza. We call for allowing access for relevant United Nations agencies and their implementing partners. We welcome the initial transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza via the Rafah crossing. We commend the efforts of the United Nations, Egypt, Jordan, as well as other parties in this regard, and hope that other deliveries will follow. We also express our gratitude to the personnel of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, as well as that of UNRWA, bravely assisting those in need. As we can see, they prove they are ready for the ultimate sacrifice while helping others. This should remind us that the security of all those providing humanitarian assistance is critical. Excellencies, taking into account the current tragic situation, especially now, we should not leave Gaza Palestinians without support. For decades, Poland has been involved in humanitarian and development aid in the Middle East, with particular focus on Palestine and Lebanon. In face of the current crisis, it is important to continue assistance activities, and we will do so by bilateral and multilateral channels. Poland's participation in UNIFIL is a clear proof of our wider political commitment to the stabilization of the Middle East. We are determined to continue our participation in this mission. Excellencies, Poland knows very well the consequences of war, invasion, and terror, which are felt for generations. This is why we reiterate that escalation and spreading of the conflict will have devastating and long-lasting consequences. This is also why we call all the parties not to succumb to the logic of violence. We all know that the Middle East peace process has always been a fragile one, and no act of violence would bring us closer to its positive solution. We should make every effort to reach the cessation of hostilities and to return to a diplomatic path of this dispute. We remain committed to a negotiated and viable two-state solution built upon the internationally agreed parameters. Our overarching goal is the preservation of the principles of international law. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gurwil for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Elizabeth Taylor Jay, Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs of Colombia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, the conflict between Israel and Palestine is undoubtedly a source of great concern for Colombia and the whole international community. The violence that has been escalating since the 7th of October, which principally affects the civilian population, demands decisive and coordinated action to be taken here at the United Nations, and in particular in the Security Council, the supreme organ that is responsible for international peace and security. Colombia, consistent with our historic and traditional position, promotes a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we are also a country committed to international peace and international humanitarian law, and we emphatically reject any attack on civilian populations. The loss of thousands of human lives that we've seen in recent days, and the degradation of living conditions. Colombia would recall here the importance of respecting the principles of distinction, proportionality, and the protection of those things which are essential for the survival of the civilian population, and access to resources that are indispensable for guaranteeing life. In this regard, Colombia joins in with the voice of the Secretary General, the United Nations agencies, and the other very many voices, including those expressed in the countless demonstrations around the world that have demonstrated their repudiation of this situation. The world is crying out for a guarantee of access for humanitarian aid aimed at alleviating the suffering of the civilian population. Children, women, older persons, the sick, today, unfortunately, are the ones that are worst affected by this confrontation. Colombia urgently calls upon the Security Council to take measures in the face of the blockade, which currently is preventing the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, the entry of fuel, hospital supplies, medicines, and resources that are indispensable for essential health functions, and the generators in hospitals and the water treatment plants. These supplies need to reach all areas affected by the conflict, including the north of Gaza. Humanitarian operations must be protected and facilitated as is established in the Rome Statute. If this doesn't happen, then we're going back to the worst times of human barbarity, which were characterized by the absence of minimum rules in the conduct of war. Today, we are witness to the total disregard of international humanitarian law. This disregard is totally rejected by my country. We have always been faithful to our historic position. Excellencies, violence only causes greater suffering and increases the number of obstacles standing in the way of achieving a peaceful and sustainable solution. Mr. President, my country reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities between the parties to the conflict, and that there be a resumption of peace negotiations that will make it possible to stabilize the situation on the understanding that the conflict must be solved through dialogue and its solution must be supported in multilateral fora. In particular, the solution must unavoidably be in full accordance with the numerous resolutions of the United Nations Organization, implementing the solution of two states as established in Resolution 181-2 of the General Assembly of 1947, the vision for which was ratified by the Security Council in subsequent decisions. The international legal order must be preserved. That is the basis for peace. In order to do this, and in accordance with what was stated by the President of the Republic in their speech to the General Assembly in September, Colombia insists on the urgent need to convene as soon as possible an international conference of peace that will avoid the current conflict becoming more prolonged or geographically extended. We have to come out of this barbarity and open up space for immediate peace. That is the only way out of a conflict which has now gone on for so many decades. Excellencies, let us put an end to wars in order to protect life and save the planet. Thank you very much.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Taylor Jay for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Abul Gheit, Secretary General of the League of Arab States.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Brazil for convening this urgent meeting to discuss the serious situation in Gaza. Honestly, we believe that the credibility of the Council is at stake. What is happening today in Gaza, this war of vengeance, only aims to collectively punish millions of people whose only crime is that they live in the Gaza Strip. This is a violation of international law and international humanitarian law, which are the pillars of the international order. And the pillar of peace and security, for whom the Security Council is responsible. On the 11th of October this year, the League of Arab States has taken a clear stance towards what is transpiring in Israel and the Gaza Strip. The League condemned unequivocally the targeting and the killing of civilians on both sides. This stance was welcomed by the international community. We hope that you all would remember that this stance was taken as we are convinced of the need to respect international humanitarian law by all parties. One of the principles of international humanitarian law pertains to the distinction between armed combatants on the one hand and civilians on the other. This principle has been violated every hour and every minute by Israel in the Gaza Strip over the past 2 weeks. Although this is the principle that guarantees that humanity would not descend again into the depths of barbarism and brutality that we've seen in previous wars prior to the adoption of the Geneva Conventions. The Israeli war on civilians in Gaza must stop immediately. This is the only way to prevent a major humanitarian disaster, to prevent a massacre that, if it happened in full view of the world would never forgive itself. This is a rabid war that claims every day hundreds of lives. Innocent civilians. Stopping this war is the responsibility of this council as a guarantor for international peace and security. This is a war without a clear strategy. Except for blind vengeance, it doesn't have a known time frame. We are surprised by those who are holding on to what they call the right to self-defense as a justification for the most serious atrocities. We're even more surprised by those who accept that this war is being waged outside the realm of international humanitarian law, meaning the law of war. And without any red lines, we see before us a plot being hatched before us to punish the people of Gaza, all of them, without any distinction, by bombarding their homes, starving them, depriving them of the basic necessities of life: food, water, medical treatment, fuel. We're all following with great concern that Israeli forces are still pressing the people of Gaza to leave their homes and forcibly displacing them from the north of Gaza to the south of Gaza, as if the aim was to create a humanitarian disaster, whether inside the strip or along the borders with Egypt. This opens the door for a second wave of forced displacement of the people of Gaza, and they're all refugees as is. The world must be warned. The League of Arab States rejects forcible displacement, not only because it's a crime under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it is also a systematic strategy that Israel seeks to apply to liquidate the Palestinian cause. I'm fully confident that the Palestinian people is aware of this threat to their cause. And I'm confident that Arab countries in the region are also aware of this threat. But it is shameful for the world to allow any official of any state to repeat this nonsense that will not be implemented on the ground. It will just increase the fury and the bitterness and violence Palestinians and Arabs are not going to go through a second Nakba. We hope that the world, through this council, understands this assertion. The urgent priority today is to establish a sustainable mechanism to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid from Egypt to Gaza through the Rafah crossing, and to establish a connected supply lines to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza until calm is restored. The trucks that entered in the past few days are merely a drop in the ocean of needs. People in Gaza have been relying on 100 trucks loaded with necessities, food and medicine, daily, and I repeat, daily. I recall for the Security Council that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict did not start on the 7th of October, and the Palestinian cause is not and will not one of the tributaries of the war on terrorism. We warned, and others warned, that the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, all occupied territories, whether in Gaza, the West Bank, or East Jerusalem, where Palestinians are living under the yoke of military occupation based on racial apartheid. This situation cannot be sustainable, cannot go on. Violence will only beget more violence and the desire to retaliate. It is time to address the root cause for the cycles of violence, ending the occupation, and establishing an independent Palestinian state along the lines of 1967 can achieve peace for all. Standing on the right side of history means, in reality and unequivocally, standing on the side of Palestinian rights and Palestinian people, and not on the side of the occupying power. I repeat, occupying power. The only formula that would preserve the dignity and freedom of the Palestinian people and safety for the Israelis is the two-state solution. I hope the current developments would compel us to think about the future, about future generations, without repeating the mistakes of the past. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abulgate for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Mr. President, Mexico has come to this meeting in the light of the critical escalation of hostilities between Israel and Hamas and the situation in the Gaza Strip, an integral part of the occupied Palestinian territory. If this conflict does not cease immediately, it may produce a disastrous humanitarian situation with immeasurable consequences that are unprecedented. We recognize and are grateful for the work undertaken by this organization under the leadership of the Secretary General, and we very much regret the loss of life of 35 workers of the organization. Mexico reiterates its robust and unequivocal condemnation of terrorism and violent extremism in all its forms and manifestations, irrespective of where, by whom and for what purposes it is committed. As this Council has stated, any act of terrorism constitutes a threat to international peace and security. My country reiterates its robust condemnation also of the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October against Israel by Hamas and other extremist organizations in Gaza that led to the loss of more than 1,400 lives. And like the Secretary General, Mexico calls for the immediate unconditional release of the hostages that are in Hamas's custody, amongst them 2 Mexican nationals. The Israeli response, on the other hand, has led to almost 5,000 people that have died, 14,200 wounded, and incalculable damage to the civilian infrastructure. Mexico recognizes the right of Israel to protect its citizens and its territory, as well as to guarantee their security. But that has to be done in strict adherence with international law and observing the principles of necessity and proportionality that govern any use of force. We call for an immediate and lasting cessation of the hostilities in all parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly the indiscriminate attacks and the violence against civilians by all parties to the conflict, and for a lifting of the siege currently being suffered by the Palestinian people in Gaza, and this in accordance with Resolution 1860. In accordance with international humanitarian law, any indiscriminate attack or directed against the civilian population under any circumstances, as well as against medical or humanitarian staff or against civilian assets or essential infrastructure, is contrary to the principle of distinction, which is applicable to all situations of armed conflict at all times and in all places. This conduct could constitute war crimes because they are serious infringements of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Any reprisal is contrary to international law. Mexico condemns and repudiates in the most robust terms the situation that occurred in the Al-Hali hospital in the north of the Gaza Strip, as well as all the other attacks in recent days on civilian assets or installations. Therefore, it's essential that there be an independent and impartial investigation of these attacks in order to clarify the facts, determine responsibility, and ensure accountability. We welcome the entry of humanitarian assistance through the border point of Rafah, connecting Egypt to the Gaza Strip. Nevertheless, 34 deliveries that have been delivered until now are insufficient, and that is why we would call for urgent entry and uninterrupted access for humanitarian items, including water and fuel. It should also be possible for civilians to pass through this corridor between Gaza and Egypt, as well as through West Bank and East Jerusalem. Mexico is very concerned at the increase in intensity and frequency of acts of violence, military checkpoints, and attacks by Israeli settlers, and we are very alarmed about a possible military incursion by Israel to the north of Gaza. This will only worsen the situation for the civilian population. Mexico believes that it's unacceptable that the United States used its veto on the 18th of October to prevent Security Council action. The draft resolution that was proposed by Brazil was a balanced text, essentially humanitarian in nature. Since 1945, Mexico has maintained an unshakable position against the exercise of the veto, and we reiterate our call for those that have not yet done so to join the French-Mexican initiative on the restriction of the use of the veto that already has 106 signatories. Mr. President, the responsibility to renew the peace process and de-escalate the violence falls on the parties involved in the conflict. The Security Council and the international community, we have the collective responsibility to promote a political process that will promote lasting peace. We recognize also the convening by Egypt of the Peace Summit last week, and we would call upon regional actors to exercise maximum restraint and avoid a spread of the conflict. No occupation is legal, and it is always the result of the breaking of the international order in contravention of the UN Charter. There is also no right to an indefinite occupation that has already, on the ground, changed the demographic, economic, and social reality of the occupied territory and their inhabitants, leading to changes that are potentially irreversible on the ground. In accordance with international law, any acquisition of territory attained by force is null and void, and the international community has the obligation to require of the occupying power that it cease its occupation and any other acts that affect the territorial integrity of the State of Palestine, and that it adhere to pertinent resolutions of this Council. If we don't deal with the structural causes of the conflict, including the oppression and the recurrent violations of human rights, we will continue to see more cycles of violence and destruction. Mexico favours a political, comprehensive, lasting solution to the conflict under the premise of two states that will deal with the legitimate security concerns of Israel and allow for the consolidation of the Palestinian state that is politically viable and economically viable, that lives with Israel within secure and internationally recognized borders in accordance with pertinent resolutions of the United Nations. As indicated by our Foreign Affairs Minister on the 23rd of September in the General Assembly, we must recognize the right of the people of Israel, but not to the expense of the Palestinian people. Mexico, a country that has a foreign policy that is based on international law, has always and always will defend the peaceful settlement of disputes over and above threats or the use of force. That is why we will continue to support all efforts aimed at establishing a peace that is based on mutual respect and full adherence to international law. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, the current situation in Israel and Gaza, initiated by the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October, is extremely alarming. We strongly condemn the abhorrent and indiscriminate Hamas terrorist attacks 17 days ago. These attacks by Hamas cannot be justified under any circumstances. The Republic of Korea urges the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages. Mr. President, we are facing the most dangerous moment of the last 5 decades in this region. Until now, more than 6,000 people, mostly civilians, have died in Israel and Gaza. The number of casualties are rapidly increasing. Innocent civilians are losing their lives. Those alive are suffering from the acute shortages of necessities, including water, food, and medical supplies. UN staff members, health workers, and journalists, none of them are safe under the current situation. All civilian lives matter, and all civilians must be protected under international humanitarian law. As such, all parties must abide by the rules under international humanitarian law. And protection of a civilian is the core pillar in this regard. Rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian aid is also essential for the survival of the civilian population and must be guaranteed under international humanitarian law. Humanitarian workers and medical personnel must be protected too. In this regard, we welcome the Secretary General's announcement on the 21st of October of initial provision of humanitarian supplies to civilians in Gaza through Rafah crossing, with additional deliveries of supplies on the 22nd and 23rd of October. We hope that enough humanitarian supplies can be constantly delivered to those in need. We highly appreciate all diplomatic efforts by major players in this region, including Egypt, the United States, to facilitate rapid, safe, and unimpeded access of humanitarian relief. Mr. President, unfortunately, the entire area is increasingly vulnerable, and we are now facing a high risk of serious spillover to other parts of the region. The level of tension in the West Bank is steadily growing, and ongoing exchange of fire across the blue line in the southern Lebanon is very worrisome. The international community must use all possible means at its disposal to prevent further exacerbation of the current situation. Mr. President, protecting civilians and preventing spillover must serve as our guiding priorities at this fragile moment. At the same time, to break the cycle of violence, we also have to renew our efforts to revive political process. We believe the sustainable peace in this region can only be achieved through sincere negotiations based on the two-state solutions with the security and dignity for both Israel and Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to start my statement today by expressing our grave condolences to all the victims, both in Israel and in Palestine. The indelible scars left on all those affected must inspire us to redouble our efforts to seek peace. We thank you, Mr. President, and your team for your tireless efforts to seek consensus on a Security Council resolution last week that would have called for humanitarian pauses to allow full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. We were disappointed that in the end, the Council was unable to live up to its responsibility under the UN Charter due to the use of the veto. The political organs of the United Nations must not be silent in this situation, which is a tragic crisis of our collective obligation to protect civilian populations. Mr. President, Liechtenstein condemns the terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians by Hamas and other groups, and the massive violation of international humanitarian law, in particular the targeting of civilians, mass killings, abduction, and hostage-taking, among others, as well as the threat of killing of hostages. The firing of rockets from Gaza on civilian targets and the deliberate targeting of civilians are grave violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. Mr. President, we affirm the right of Israel to defend itself in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and in particular its principles of discrimination and proportionality. A siege of Gaza, as declared by Israeli military leaders, amounts to an act of collective punishment that violates international humanitarian law. The large numbers of civilian casualties, a very large number of them children, that have resulted in Gaza to date are unacceptable. Mr. President, for the immediate future, we must set the protection of civilians as our highest priority. International humanitarian law, including the basic principles for the protection of civilians therein, must be safeguarded at all times by all actors, and there must be accountability for their violation. We note in this respect the investigation of the International Criminal Court that has been active for almost a decade and look forward to the court's concrete action. Mr. President, the United Nations and this Council in particular have a crucial responsibility in this situation, preventing a further escalation of the Gaza war, which has already led to dangerous violence and heightened instability in the West Bank and in the wider region is one key aspect. But the peace and security that this Council is mandated to protect in this most dire of situations is fundamentally also people-centered. To this end, ensuring safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to the population in the most urgent need of assistance is crucial, in conjunction with the full respect for all relevant provisions of international humanitarian law by the conflict parties. We commend Secretary General Guterres for his leadership, and we hope that this Council will be able to live up to its responsibilities. In rising to the challenge, the Council's approach must be grounded in our shared humanity and guided by international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Morocco.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank you for organizing this meeting that is presided by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. I would also like to thank His Excellency, the Secretary General, and Mr. Tor Wensland, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for their valuable briefings. We would like to align ourselves with the statement delivered by His Excellency, Dr. Ayman Safadi, on behalf of the Arab Group. Mr. President, we gather here today under difficult circumstances for the Palestinian cause. The bloody and brutal events of last week and the accompanying tensions, they warn that we are before an unprecedented situation, and the conflict could even become more dangerous with repercussions over the entire Middle East. Following the eruption of these events, the Kingdom of Morocco presided over a meeting of the League of Arab States on the 11th of October, which resulted in Resolution 8987. It called on all parties to exercise self-restraint. It reaffirmed the need to protect all civilians. It condemned the suffering of the Palestinian people, and it reaffirmed our support to the Palestinian people in their land, and we warned against any attempt to displace the Palestinian people. We also participated in the Cairo Peace Summit. We reaffirmed the need to de-escalate, to stop the bloodshed, to put an end to military attacks, to protect all civilians and not to target civilians pursuant to the principles of international law, and to allow for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the residents of the Gaza Strip in an urgent, continuous, and sufficient manner, to reject any displacement of Palestinians from their homes. This is a threat to the national security of neighboring countries. We also stressed the need to relaunch a genuine peace process that would lead to the implementation of the two-state solution. His Majesty King Mohammed VI gave his instructions to the head of Al-Quds Committee yesterday in order to send urgent humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. These would include food, medicine, and water. We will also coordinate the delivery of this assistance with the Egyptian and Palestinian authorities. This is part of the commitment of His Majesty to the Palestinian cause. His Majesty also gave his instructions to send 2 airplanes with urgent humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. Morocco remains on the side of the Palestinian people and their legitimate rights. We support this two-state solution that would lead to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state along the lines of June 4, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, a state that is viable, that lives side by side with Israel in peace, reassurance, and security. The Kingdom of Morocco reaffirms the need to put an end to all measures that jeopardized the legal and historic status of the Holy City in order to serve peace and stability, so that this conflict does not turn from a political conflict to a religious conflict that would have dangerous repercussions on all. Jerusalem must remain a land and a symbol of peaceful coexistence for all 3 religions. We must reaffirm the need to respect others. Following the Jerusalem call that was signed by His Majesty the King and His Holiness Pope Francis on the 30th of March 2019. In conclusion, I would like to recall the content of the letter sent by His Majesty the King on the 12th of February 2023 to those who participated in the Cairo Peace Summit. We believe that peace in the Middle East is a strategic option. Therefore, the Kingdom of Morocco will continue to make every possible effort. We will use our relations with all parties and international actors in order to contribute to any international effort to relaunch the dialogue and negotiation process, as this is the only way to put an end to the conflict, to achieve security, stability, and prosperity to the Middle East. End of quote. Therefore, the Kingdom of Morocco will remain ready to coordinate with all partners in order to engage in any international efforts that would end the current tragic situation in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Morocco for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of New Zealand.
Thank you to Brazil for organising today's debate, and thank you also to Secretary-General Guterres, Special Coordinator Venezuelan, and Deputy Special Coordinator Hastings for their briefings. President, even as this Council convenes, the deadly violence and bloodshed in Israel and Palestine persists. By day's end, more civilians will have tragically and needlessly lost their lives, some of them infants and children. It is intolerable to see civilians continue to suffer disproportionately as innocent victims of this conflict. New Zealand condemns absolutely Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel. We are appalled by their brutality, their targeting of civilians, and the taking of hostages, which are clear violations of international law. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We support Israel's right to defend itself in full compliance with international law, including in respect of actions taken in Gaza. Ultimately, though, there is no military solution that will bring about a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians. The protection of civilians and delivery of humanitarian assistance is the most urgent priority. New Zealand joins calls for a humanitarian pause to provide neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian organisations an opportunity to provide assistance and protection to those in Gaza who desperately need it. President, when New Zealand last served on the UN Security Council in 2015-2016, we championed Resolution 2286, which demands greater protection for healthcare in armed conflict, including hospitals and medical personnel. Healthcare facilities must never be used for military purposes or be the object of attack. We're deeply concerned about the significant flows of internally displaced persons. Their safety and security must be protected. We call for the establishment of designated safe areas that are strictly off limits as targets and/or for military use, and also call for humanitarian corridors to ensure the vital assistance reaches where it is most needed. We expect Israel and Hamas to act in accordance with international humanitarian law, which imposes obligations upon all parties engaged in armed conflict. Israel also has an obligation under international humanitarian law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, to provide basic needs for civilians in Gaza, including food, water, energy, and shelter, and to facilitate humanitarian aid. These legal obligations cannot be dispensed with in times of conflict. New Zealand urges all parties, including Israel and Egypt, to rapidly facilitate access for the delivery of urgent humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza through the Rafah border crossing. The volume of aid arriving in Gaza must significantly increase from recent levels. For our part, New Zealand is supporting humanitarian appeals for populations in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. We stand ready to increase our support in coming weeks. We deeply regret that the Security Council has been unable to adopt a resolution and discharge its responsibilities, its duties under the Charter. As UN Secretary-General Guterres has said, we must ensure we advance all efforts to avoid any regional spillover to the wider Middle East. We welcome all opportunities to urgently de-escalate hostilities, including initiatives by the UN and other countries in the region and beyond. This is not a time for political posturing or for using the conflict to advance any cause except bringing peace and security to Israel, Gaza, and the wider region. It is a time for de-escalation. Finally, New Zealand remains committed to a two-state solution which envisions an independent state of Palestine living in peace and security alongside the state of Israel. A new political horizon is essential. We call on the international community to take urgent action to advance the Middle East peace process. Without it, the armed conflict may eventually cease, but there will be no winners. We will never be free of the violence, the loss of innocent lives, the hatred, the anti-Semitism, and the Islamophobia that has erupted in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, and around the world since 7 October. As the UN Secretary-General has said, Too many lives and the fate of the entire region hang in the balance. We cannot afford to fail. We must act now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of New Zealand for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're grateful for this opportunity to participate in this open debate to signal the importance that we attach to this issue. We'd like to thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and the Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and Resident Coordinator of the United Nations in the occupied Palestinian territory. I will be reading an extract from a speech. The full version will be published. Chile promotes the solution of two states and the right of Israel and Palestine to live in harmony within internationally secure and recognized borders in full respect for human rights of all its inhabitants. This solution, nevertheless, is far from becoming a reality, and it's taken on a whole new dimension following the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October and the indiscriminate response of the State of Israel on the civilian population that lives in the Gaza Strip. Chile unreservedly condemns the actions of Hamas and all terrorist acts of violence and hostilities against a civilian population. That is why we also call for the unconditional release of all hostages in the hands of the terrorist organization, ensuring their well-being and treatment in accordance with international law. In the same way, Chile is profoundly concerned to see the military operation in Gaza, the exercise of force as part of legitimate defense of a state that has been attacked